his father died bitter, alone, and convinced that trusting people was the one mistake you should never make twice. Ethan had believed him his whole life, until the morning a woman with one suitcase and no explanations walked into his dying ranch and quietly, stubbornly, without asking for anything in return, proved every lesson his father ever taught him wrong. Welcome to a channel built on the stories that shaped the soul of the West. Love that endures the harshest winters, the fierce heart of a mother, compassion that crosses every divide, and the kind of human connection that makes a hard life worth living. The greatest inheritance a father can leave his children is not land or money. It is the wisdom to know the difference between the people who will hurt you and the people who will save you. Subscribe to this channel and join thousands of hearts who refuse to stop believing in goodness. Like this video, share it with someone you love, and tell me in the comments, what did your father teach you that turned out to be wrong?
The day Clara Bennett arrived, Ethan was busy shoeing a horse that did not need new shoes, just to avoid admitting he had finally broken down and hired help. Mr. Cole, he did not even look up. Cookhouse is that log building over yonder. Do not get your hopes up. I was not planning to. Something in her voice made him look. She was not the desperate widow or runaway girl he expected. She just stood there in a plain dress with a single suitcase, her eyes steady and sure. "I need to know if you can actually cook," Ethan said. "The last one we had could not boil water." "I can cook." That is what she said, too. Clara set her bag down. "Mr. Cole, I rode 2 days in a stinking wagon to get here. I figure you are just as desperate as I am. So let us skip the part where you test my patience, and I will skip the part where I leave. Just show me the kitchen." Ethan was stunned. Nobody had talked to him like that in a long time. "Kitchen is a mighty generous word for what you are about to see," he finally said. She picked up her bag. I have seen worse. She was wrong. The place was a disaster. Old food was caked on every surface, and the stove was coated in grease. It smelled like failure. "The last cook was a ranch hand who drew the short straw," Ethan mumbled. "We have been through 4 of them in 6 months. I can see why." She rolled up her sleeves. "How many men am I feeding?" "Just me," he admitted. "But I am hoping for a crew of 8 by the spring drive." Clara looked him dead in the eye. "Are you hoping or are you planning? What is the difference? Hope is for when you have given up. Planning is for when you aim to win." Something stirred in Ethan's chest. "I will have a crew," he said. "One way or another." "Good," Clara said, opening a cabinet that spilled stale food onto the floor. "Because I came here to feed cowboys, not just one stubborn rancher." That night, Ethan ate the best beef stew of his life. He sat all alone at a long table that once held 20 men, wondering how she had made magic from his rotten supplies. "You did not learn to cook like this on a ranch," he said. "No. Does it matter where? It does. I am losing this ranch because I cannot make people stay. If you are just going to leave like the rest, I would rather know now." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I worked in a big hotel kitchen in Chicago," she said softly. "I learned to handle pressure." "Why did you leave?" "For the same reason you are still here. Sometimes leaving is the only way to survive." The next morning he found her in the dirt patch behind the cookhouse planting a vegetable garden. "It is March," he said. "Nothing will grow. That's why I'm planning now instead of hoping later," she replied with a tiny smile. "I learned that from a fella I met recently." "You need supplies, you talk to me first. We are short on cash." "I noticed," Clara said, standing up. "I also noticed your supply accounts are a mess. You are paying double for bad food. Whoever handles your books is either a fool or a thief." "That would be me," Ethan said, his jaw tight. "Oh. Well," she said, not missing a beat, "then you are just the fool, which is better. We can fix that. I am not broken. Mr. Cole, your food problem is a money problem. You are getting cheated. Let me handle the suppliers. You are a cook, not an accountant. In Chicago, I manage the accounts for a 300-seat restaurant. I know a bad deal when I see one. But it is your ranch. He hated to admit she was right, but his pride had already cost him too much. Fine, he grumbled. Look at the books. But you ask me before you change a thing. 3 days later, Ethan was in town with a new shopping list from Clara. She had found new suppliers that would save him almost 30%. Standing in the general store, he finally felt like he was not all alone in this fight. "Ethan Cole," a familiar voice called out. It was Jack Morrison, an old hand. "I heard things are changing out at Silver Ridge. Pete Jensen said your new cook gave him the best meal he had eaten in a year. Some folks say you cannot outrun your past. Well, for Clara Bennett, the past was not just following her. It was coming with guns. She thought she had found a safe place at Ethan Cole's struggling ranch in Montana, a place she brought back to life with a cast-iron skillet and a kind heart. But Ethan was a man who trusted nobody. He was about to learn that sometimes the only way to save your home is to trust a stranger and fight for what is right. In just a few weeks, Clara had turned the whole place around. She learned every cowboy's name, kept coffee hot all night for the watch, and was even teaching 15-year-old Tommy, the stable boy, how to read. The Silver Ridge Ranch started to feel less like a job and more like a home. One evening, Ethan found her working on the supply accounts long after supper. He sat down across from her. "You have changed everything," he said. "The crew is back, and this place feels alive. I just need to know why you care so much." She finally looked up from her papers. "I left Chicago because I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up, and good people got hurt. I will not make that mistake again. I chose to be someone who shows up and does the work, no matter how small." Ethan felt something break loose inside him, something that had been locked up tight since his father died. "My father used to say, 'Trust the land, never trust people.' He got burned too many times. By the time he passed, he did not trust anyone but me." "And you believed him," Ethan admitted. "I had no reason not to. Everyone always left until you showed up and proved him wrong." Clara looked away. "Mr. Cole, you should be careful about putting your faith in me. I am not staying forever. You could—" The words tumbled out before Ethan could stop them. "You could stay on if you wanted." She stood up quick. "I should finish these accounts. Good night, Mr. Cole." She left him sitting there alone, but the truth was out. He needed her for reasons that had nothing to do with cooking. 2 weeks later, a rider brought a telegram. Jack, the foreman, came galloping up to the fence line where Ethan was working. "Boss, you need to see this. It was for Clara." Ethan's gut twisted. This was it. The past had finally caught up. He found her in the cookhouse. "This came for you." The color drained from her face the second she saw it. "Who knows you are here?" Ethan asked. "No one. I was careful." She took the telegram with a shaking hand. After she read it, the paper crumpled in her fist. "I have to leave," she whispered. "Now." Ethan stood in her way. "Tell me what is happening. Maybe I can help." She looked at him with real fear in her eyes. "There is a powerful man in Chicago, Nathaniel Crow. I saw things I was not supposed to see. Terrible things. He traffics people. I was going to testify, but he owns the law there. My lawyer told me to run before he silenced me. And now he has found you." She nodded, her voice breaking. "The telegram says he is coming. He is bringing men." "He will kill me if I stay," Clara said through tears. "And he might kill all of you just for helping me. I am so sorry." Ethan's mind raced. Everything his father had warned him about was happening. But looking at Clara, the woman who had brought his ranch back from the dead, he knew his father had been wrong. Some people were worth the fight. "How long until he gets here? The telegram says 3 days. "That is enough time," Ethan said, then yelled out the door. "Jack, get the crew to the barn for a meeting, now!" "Ethan, no!" Clara grabbed his arm. "You do not understand. This man is trained killers. You are risking everything." "I know enough," Ethan said firmly. "I know you're a good person. That is all I need to know. But your father's rule. My father died alone and bitter because he could not see the good in people. I am not making his mistake. Clara, you are the best thing that has ever happened to this ranch. I am not letting anyone take you away." 20 minutes later, the whole crew stood in the barn. Ethan laid out the danger, plain and simple. "This is not your fight," he told them. "No one will blame you if you ride out." Jack spoke up first. "Boss, Clara treated us like family. That makes this our fight, too. One by one, every single man agreed. They would not let anyone touch their cook. Clara couldn't believe her eyes. Men she'd only known for a month were getting ready to fight for her. She turned to Ethan and whispered, "Why?" He looked at her, his voice low and steady. "Because you showed 'em what a family feels like. And down here, family protects its own." Now, this is a story about how sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing. It's about an everyday man who had to choose between a fortune and a person's life. Ask yourself what you would do. For the next 3 days, Ethan and his crew turned that ranch into a fortress, getting ready for a war. Clara refused to hide while others fought her battle. On that third evening, as the sun bled out across the plains, Nathaniel Crow rode in. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like money and trouble, dressed in a fancy suit that had no business being in Montana. The 6 men with him, though, they looked exactly like what they were: hired guns. Ethan stepped off the porch, his rifle held easy in his arms. Jack and 2 other hands stood with him. "You must be Cole," Crow said, his voice smooth as whiskey. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Ethan shook his head. "Don't recall taking anything of yours." Crow just smiled, a cold, empty thing. "Miss Bennett and I have some business to finish." "Miss Bennett works for me now," Ethan said flatly. "Whatever business you had is over." Crow lit a cigar, slow and deliberate, showing everyone he wasn't worried. "I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Cole. I know she lied to you, so I'm prepared to be generous." He pulled out a thick envelope. $20,000. More than enough to save this sorry ranch. That number was a punch to the gut. $20,000 would have solved every problem he had. "That's a whole lot of money," Ethan said, his voice tight. "It is," Crow agreed. "All you have to do is walk away. Let me deal with my business, and by morning you'll be a rich man." Behind him, Ethan could feel his men getting nervous. $20,000 was a king's ransom. "And what happens to her?" Ethan asked. Crow's smile got wider. "That's not your concern. I'm making it my concern. Mr. Cole, don't be a fool. I'm offering you a fortune for a woman who lied to you from the start." Ethan glanced back at the cookhouse. He saw Clara's shadow in the window, waiting to see if he'd sell her out. He remembered her gentle way with his boy, Tommy, and how she'd looked him straight in the eye and said that planning is what you do when you still believe you can win. "No," Ethan said. The word hung in the air. Crow's face hardened. "Excuse me?" "I said no. Clara stays here. You and your boys can leave now." "I don't care if it's $1 million, Ethan said, raising his rifle just a bit. "She is not for sale. You have 30 seconds to get off my land." Crow just stared, then let out a cold laugh. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I own judges and politicians. I could have you arrested for harboring a fugitive by tomorrow." "Then do it," Ethan said. "We'll see how far your Chicago warrants reach out here." "Or," Crow said, his voice turning to ice, "I could just take what's mine by force." "That'll end badly for all of us," Ethan admitted. "But you'll lose some of your expensive men, and you might just lose yourself. Is she worth all that?" For the first time, real anger flashed in Crow's eyes. "I'll give you 1 hour to think about it," Crow snarled as he got back on his horse. "Is she really worth dying for?" As they rode off, Ethan's hands started shaking. Jack came up beside him. "Boss, that was either the bravest or the dumbest thing I've ever seen." Clara came out of the cookhouse, her face pale. "You turned down $20,000. It was never my money to take." "Most men would have," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan gathered his crew. "We got 1 hour. They have more guns, but we have our land. And we have a reason to fight that's bigger than a paycheck." He looked at each man. "Last chance to walk away. No hard feelings." Nobody moved an inch. As the men took their positions, Clara pulled Ethan aside. "I have to tell you the truth." They sat on the porch as darkness fell, and she told him everything. She'd been a chef at Crow's Hotel, but it was all a front. He was trafficking young women, and she'd stumbled upon them, locked in cages. "I went to the police," she said, her voice hollow. "2 days later, one of Crow's men told me to disappear or I would. So I ran." She looked up, tears in her eyes. "But I didn't run empty-handed. I took his ledger. It has every name, every date, every dirty deal. My lawyer has a copy ready to send to the U.S. Marshals if anything happens to me." Ethan stared at her, a small spark of hope catching fire. They didn't just have to survive. They could actually win. Suddenly, the plan changed. This wasn't about defense anymore. This was about setting a trap. The attack came fast. Gunfire erupted from the darkness. Crow had brought more men, thinking he could overwhelm them. For 20 minutes, it was chaos. Then a cry cut through the noise. Young Tommy was down, clutching a bloody shoulder. He was just a boy. That was it for Ethan. This ended now. "Clara! The ledger!" he yelled. Under the cover of gunfire, she ran to the main house. A few minutes later, a bright flame shot up from the back of the property. The old smokehouse, full of cured meats and grease, was on fire. It was a perfect diversion. Several of Crow's men broke off to see what was happening. In the confusion, Ethan's crew pushed back hard, driving the remaining gunmen into the open. Ethan cornered a stunned Nathaniel Crow near the barn. He knocked the gun from the man's hand. "It's over, Crow." Just then, Clara walked out, holding the small black ledger. "A copy of this is already on its way to the marshals," she said, her voice shaking but strong. Defeat washed over Crow's face. His money couldn't save him now. Headlights cut through the dark as the sheriff and his deputies arrived, tipped off by Clara's lawyer. They took Crow and his men into custody. The ranch was quiet again. Tommy was going to be fine. Ethan walked over to Clara. "You said planning is what you do when you believe you can win." She gave him a small, tired smile. "Looks like we won." Right there, they knew they had built more than a defense. They had built a home. The moral of the story is simple. A person's character isn't measured by the money they have, but by the choices they make when everything is on the line. When Crow's men attacked, they were met with determined ranch hands ready to defend their own. The fight was fierce. A fire on the barn roof lit up the night sky. "They are trying to flush us out," Ethan realized. "It is a distraction." He gathered Jack and a few others. "We are going to circle around through the West Canyon and give them a surprise." Using their knowledge of the land, Ethan's crew trapped Crow and his men. They held them until the federal marshals arrived, bypassing the corrupt local law. Weeks later, with the ranch safe, Ethan found Clara watching the sunset. He finally asked the question he had been holding back. "You could stay, you know, for good." Clara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I think," she said, "I'm already home." It was a terrible injustice. Through the firelight, Ethan saw that coward Crow just watching his hired guns try to burn the whole ranch down. Clara's voice was quiet. "He wants me. I've been running for 2 years, and good people keep getting hurt. It is time for me to stop." "No," Ethan said, his voice hard as iron. "We are not handing you over. You stayed because I asked you to stay." Before he could say more, the front door burst open and the fight was suddenly inside the house, close and brutal. When a big man had Ethan pinned, Clara was there, swinging a heavy iron skillet that knocked the man out cold. In the middle of the chaos, one of Crow's men grabbed young Tommy and put a gun to his head. Everything stopped. Nathaniel Crow walked in through the broken door like he owned the place. "Let the boy go," Ethan demanded. Crow just smiled and looked at Clara. "This all ends now, my dear. You come back to Chicago with me, and I will call my men off. This ranch and your friends will be safe." He pointed a thumb toward the burning barn. "Or we can see how that story ends." Clara looked at the terrified boy and then at Ethan, her heart breaking. "If I go, you leave all of them alone," she said. "You have my word," Crow answered. Clara shook her head. "Your word is worth nothing." Crow pulled out a piece of paper. "Fine. A legal document. It says you return to Chicago to face the charges against you." "What charges?" Ethan yelled. "She did not do anything." The Chicago police say she is wanted for theft and fraud, Crow sneered. Of course, those charges disappear if she just agrees to be quiet about my business. Sign this. Promise to never speak of what you saw, and everyone here stays safe. If you do not sign, you are a fugitive, and Ethan is guilty of helping you. Crow's face turned to stone. Either way, you are leaving with me. Defeated, Clara looked at Ethan. It is over. I am so sorry I brought this trouble to you. She started walking toward Crow, and Ethan felt like he was watching the world end. What could they do? The man had the law and all the money on his side. Just as Crow grabbed her arm, a massive explosion outside shook the entire house. Everyone ran to the window. Crow's reinforcement wagons were on fire. Standing there with a torch was a woman Ethan had never seen before. Elizabeth? Clara gasped, her face filled with a sudden wild hope. She is a journalist, Clara explained. Just then, more riders appeared, but they were wearing federal marshal badges. Crow's face went pale. The woman, Elizabeth, shouted, "You forgot about federal investigators, Nathaniel, and you forgot I have proof of every bribe you ever paid." The lead marshal stepped forward. "Nathaniel Crow, you are under arrest for human trafficking and about 15 other things." Crow's men dropped their guns, but Crow grabbed Clara. "I will kill her!" he screamed. Ethan moved faster than thinking. He crossed the room and hit Crow with all his anger and strength. "That is for my barn," he said as the marshals put the man in irons and dragged him away. Elizabeth hugged her tight. "It's all over, Clara. We took down Crow's whole operation. The girls are safe." Clara looked at the burning barn and the wounded men, and the word free just didn't make sense. She began to laugh and cry at the very same time. Ethan felt a mile-wide canyon open between them. She could leave this disaster behind. But she turned, and her gaze stole the air from his lungs. "You risked everything for me," she said. He managed a weak smile. "We still have the land, and one heck of a story to tell." He sighed. "You can go on back to your life now, Clara. You're free." Clara stepped right up to him. "What if I don't want to go back? Chicago was never my home." She glanced around at the wreckage. "But this place, these people. Here I found folks who fought for me, folks that made me want to put down roots." Ethan shook his head. "Clara, this ranch is barely holding on. I can't offer you a thing." "I don't want things," she said, taking both his hands in hers. "I want to help rebuild. I want to argue with you about your messy books and make this a ranch your daddy would have been proud of. If you'll have me." He just stared at the woman who had been through so much, yet chose to stay. "I'm a stubborn man," he said, his voice gone thick. "I'll likely make you mad more days than not." "Well, I can handle stubborn," she smiled, "and I am not afraid of hard work." Ethan took a shaky breath. "Don't just stay on as my cook, Clara. Stay because this place means something to you. Stay because maybe I mean something to you." Her smile was like the sun breaking through a storm. "You stubborn, wonderful fool. You mean everything." Then she kissed him, right there in front of God and everybody. And in that moment, Ethan finally understood. Trust was not about avoiding pain. It was about finding someone who was worth the risk. Elizabeth finally broke the silence. "Well, I reckon you ain't going back to Chicago." Clara squeezed Ethan's hand. "No, ma'am. I think Montana is my home now." As the marshals hauled Crow's men away, the head lawman, a man named Carson, pulled Ethan aside. "Mr. Cole, there is going to be an investigation. You had best get yourself a lawyer. There is a mighty fine line between self-defense and what happened here tonight." After they rode off, the true cost of the fight became clear. The barn was nothing but smoldering ruins. The house was riddled with bullet holes, and young Tommy sat on the porch steps, pale and bleeding through a makeshift bandage. "He needs a doctor right now," Clara said. "Town is 15 miles out," Jack answered, "and most of the horses ran off." "Then we ride double," Clara commanded. "Pete, you are the strongest. You take Tommy." She took charge like she was born to it. An hour later, they carried the boy into Dr. Judith Martinez's office. She took one look and started working, pulling the bullet out while giving them a piece of her mind about the foolishness of men. "He is lucky," she said when she finished. "An inch either way and this boy would be dead." Seeing Tommy so pale, Ethan felt the guilt crush him. "This is all my fault." Clara's voice was like steel. "Don't you dare start with that." Clara's voice cut sharp. "Tommy is 15 years old and made his own choice to stand and fight. That means something, Ethan." In the surgery room, Dr. Martinez grumbled. "Y'all want to argue. Take it outside. This boy needs to rest." The sun was coming up. A whole night had gone by. Ethan felt the weight of it all. "We should head back to the ranch," he said. "Not yet," Clara said, taking his arm. "First you're going to sit while I look at your injuries." "I'm fine." "Ethan Cole, you are not fine. You're beat up and limping. Now sit down before I make you." He sat. Her hands were steady as she cleaned his cuts, but her eyes were tired. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked, her hands still. "You could be anywhere right now, safe, in Chicago." "I could," she said softly, "but this is where I choose to be." Just then, a man in a fancy suit cleared his throat behind them. "Ethan Cole," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Howard Blackwell. I own the bank." He looked around at the mess. "Heard you had some trouble. A terrible business." Ethan got to his feet. He knew this wasn't a friendly visit. "What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwell?" "I'm here to talk about what I can't do for you," Blackwell said, opening a folder. "You have a $500 loan payment due next week. Given all this damage, I'm worried about your ability to pay." Blackwell's smile was cold as ice. "I'm a businessman. I have to protect my investment, so I am calling in your loan. You have 30 days to pay in full, or the bank takes Silver Ridge Ranch." "You can't do that," Clara said. "Business is about risk, my dear," Blackwell replied, tipping his hat. "30 days, Mr. Cole." He walked off, leaving them in silence. "How much is it?" Clara asked. $3,000. Ethan's voice was empty. "There is no plan that makes $3,000 appear in 30 days. "Maybe not," Clara said, her eyes alight with fire. "But there might be a plan that buys us time." "Some fights you just can't win," Ethan said, his shoulders slumping. "My father built that ranch, and I've been watching it die. Maybe it is time to let it go." "Let it go?" Clara's voice shook with anger. "After everything we fought for? You stood up to outlaws, but you won't fight a banker for your own home? That's not being realistic, Ethan. That's being a coward." Her words hit him hard. "You once told me that planning is what you do when you still believe you can win. So which is it? Are you giving up or are you fixin' to win?" He looked into her determined eyes. "What's the plan?" he finally asked. Back at Silver Ridge, Ethan's heart swelled. The ranch hands had been working all night, clearing rubble and gathering the horses. "Boss," Jack called out, "we heard the news. We know you probably can't pay us right now, but we're staying anyway. We owe you that much." Ethan was too choked up to speak, so he just nodded. Clara called everyone over. "All right, let's figure this out." They took stock of everything. The barn was gone, but the house was livable. They'd lost a few horses, but most of the food was safe. "The real problem is cash," Jack said. "We need supplies." "The spring cattle drive is 6 weeks away," one of the hands said. "That's too long," Ethan replied. "The bank wants its money in 30 days. Clara, who had been writing down numbers, looked up. "What if we move up the drive?" Everyone stared at her like she had grown a second head. "That's impossible," Jack said. "The cattle ain't ready and the routes ain't clear." "So we don't use the old routes," she countered. "We drive the herd straight to the railhead at Billings. It is 300 miles of rough country. But if we make it, we get paid right away." Ethan did the math in his head. "If we do not lose too many on the trail, it could bring in $4,000. Then that is our plan, Clara declared. And Billings, staying here means we lose the ranch, plain and simple. This cattle drive is our only shot. Clara looked him dead in the eye. You asked if I was just hoping to win. No, I am planning on it. Are you with me? Ethan looked at his crew, men who had stuck by him through thick and thin. All right, he said. We do the drive, but we do it smart. In the whirlwind of the next week, they gathered 200 head of ornery cattle, mended their gear, and used the last of their credit for supplies. Clara worked from sun-up to sundown, packing food. Even young Tommy, with his arm in a sling, refused to be left behind. I took a bullet for this place, he said. I am seeing this through. Ethan looked to Clara, who just smiled. He is part of the crew, Ethan. It is his choice. 3 days before they left, Elizabeth rode in with news. The government was offering a $10,000 reward for information on Crow, but it would not pay out for months. She did, however, hand Clara an envelope. This is from the girls you saved. Clara's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was $300 and a letter. Tears streamed down her face as she read their words of thanks, how she gave them hope when they had none. They said they were praying for her. $300, Jack said softly. That is more than a start, Clara said, wiping her eyes. It is a reminder of why we are doing this. We are fighting for them, too. The night before they set off, Ethan found Clara in the cookhouse. You do not have to come, he said. It is going to be a dangerous ride. Clara turned to face him squarely. Are you trying to protect me or get rid of me? Protect you. Always. I do not need protecting, Ethan. I need to be a part of this. We are in this together. He pulled her close and admitted, I am scared. Scared we will fail. Scared I will lose you. Fear is just love with nowhere to go, she said gently. You are afraid because you care. That is what makes you strong. You taught me that caring is worth the risk. Now I am teaching you the same lesson. They held each other, a quiet moment before the hardest journey of their lives. Promise me something, Ethan said. That no matter what happens, you will remember you are the reason this ranch is still here, not me. I was ready to give up before you came along. You saved me, Clara Bennett. Ethan, I love you. The words just came tumbling out. I know the timing is terrible, but I need you to know. Clara's eyes welled up with tears. You stubborn, wonderful man. I love you too. I have loved you since you turned down a fortune to fight for a cook you barely knew. I have loved you every day since. Their kiss was not one of desperation, but of two people who had finally found their way home. We are going to make it, Clara whispered against his forehead. How can you be so sure? Because I have faith in us. We have already been through the worst, and we are still standing. At dawn, the small crew mounted their horses. They had 8 cowboys, 1 tough-as-nails cook, and 200 wild cattle. The odds were long, and the risks were enormous. But as Ethan watched Clara ride beside him, he knew his father had been wrong. The best things in life were always worth risking everything for. As the sun came up, they drove the herd out, leaving Silver Ridge Ranch behind them, damaged, but not defeated. The first few days on the trail were pure misery. They lost a dozen head of cattle right off the bat. The animals spooked and mean. By nightfall, the crew was worn out and questioning the whole idea. We cannot afford to lose that many every day, Jack said, his face grim. We will do better tomorrow, Clara insisted over the campfire. The cattle will settle. We will find our rhythm. Ethan could not share her confidence. Young Tommy was hurting bad, his shoulder wound weeping again. He gritted his teeth and refused to turn back. You all risked your lives for me, he said. I am not quitting on you. Then a spring storm rolled in, turning the ground to a freezing slush. The herd scattered when lightning struck, and they lost 8 more. By the time they rounded them up, the men were soaked, cold, and angry. This is insane, Pete grumbled. We're going to kill ourselves out here. Then go back, Ethan snapped, his patience gone. No one is forcing you to stay. The words hung in the cold air, but no one left. Later that night, Clara found him standing watch, staring out at the herd. You are pushing them too hard, she said softly. I am pushing. On the trail, Ethan worried. I am pushing everyone too hard, especially you. I can handle it, Clara said. Are you just trying to keep my spirits up? He asked. She stepped closer. I am fighting for our future, Ethan. Not just yours. Ours. Every mile we cover gets us closer to saving the ranch and building something together. We only fail if we give up. He pulled her close. I do not deserve you. Good thing I am not asking for what you deserve, she whispered, kissing him. I am choosing what I want. The next day, they reached the Yellowstone River. It was 100 yards of churning, freezing water, and there was no way around it. We should wait, Jack said, his eyes on the fast-moving river. The water is too high and moving too fast. We are already behind schedule, Ethan snapped back. We are crossing today. He knew it was a risk, but he spurred his horse into the cold, churning water first to show it could be done. The current was fierce, but he fought it and made it to the other side. See? It's manageable, he yelled back. The first 50 head of cattle crossed over with no trouble. But then one steer panicked, and in a heartbeat, 20 animals were thrashing against the current. Let 'em go, Jack hollered. But young Tommy rode right into that mess, trying to rope a drowning calf. The boy's horse lost its footing, and both of them disappeared under the water. Clara screamed Tommy's name and spurred her own horse into the river without a second thought. Ethan's heart just stopped. He watched her fight the current and grab the boy's collar right as he went under again. For a terrible second, he thought he would lose them both. Then Jack's rope flew out, catching Clara's saddle horn, and the other men helped drag all three of them ashore. Tommy coughed up half the river, his shoulder bleeding worse than before. You brave, foolish boy, Clara gasped, shaking from the cold. I saved the calf, he rasped. And he had, but they lost 32 head of cattle in that crossing. Pete looked at what was left of the herd. We are done. There is no coming back from this. We don't have enough cattle left to pay the bank. Pete's words hung in the cold air. They had started with 200 head and were now down to 150. Ethan's voice was hard as stone. We keep going. Turning back now means we lose it all for sure. At least pushing forward gives us a chance. He looked at each of his men. My father built that ranch from nothing and never quit. I will not be the son who gives up. After a long quiet, Jack spoke for the crew. All right, boss, we are with you to Billings. But that night, as they camped, young Tommy's fever spiked from his wound. By midnight, the boy was talking nonsense, lost to the pain. Clara pulled Ethan aside. He needs a doctor. The nearest town is a 2-day ride north. Ethan's voice cracked. 2 days is time we do not have. If we stop, we lose the ranch for certain. Then Tommy took that bullet for nothing. I hate this, she whispered, her eyes full of tears. I hate that you are right. They sat with Tommy all through the night. Just as the sun started to rise, his fever finally broke. He woke up weak, but his eyes were clear. Did we lose the herd? He whispered. Not yet, Ethan told him. We are still fighting. Good, Tommy said, closing his eyes. Do not ever stop fighting, boss. So they pushed on into a brutal rhythm of dust and exhaustion. That land was just plain mean. It was a place of rock that broke a steer's hooves and thorns that tore at a horse's hide. Ethan's crew was fighting the land and the clock, with a bank payment due in 12 days. After a week of hard riding, they were still a day behind schedule. The next morning, trouble came head-on. Another cattle drive, 200 head strong, was using their trail coming right at them. The other foreman rode up, madder than a wet hen. Northbound drives got the right of way. That's the law of the trail. Ethan shook his head. We can't spare the time. Just as things were about to get ugly, Clara rode her horse right between the two men. Gentlemen, she said, calm as you please, fighting won't solve this. Why don't we just split the trail? Your herd takes the west, and ours will take the east. The foreman gave her a long look. And who might you be? Clara smiled a little. Just someone who's tired of men using their fists when their heads would work better. He finally gave a stiff nod. It took 3 long hours, but her plan worked perfectly. They barely lost a single cow. As the other drive faded into the distance, Jack tipped his hat to her. "Boss, you need to make her a full partner." Ethan just watched Clara, a small smile on his face. "I'm planning on it." By the 10th day, everyone was worn to a frazzle. The horses were limping and the cattle were thin. Billings was just 3 days away, but then disaster struck. They woke up to find 20 cattle gone. Not strayed, but stolen. The tracks told the story plain as day. Rustlers had hit them in the dead of night. "We're going after 'em," Ethan said, his voice hard as iron. Jack protested, "Boss, they got a 6-hour lead. It's suicide." "I don't care," Ethan bit out. "That's my ranch they're stealing." Clara put a hand on his arm. "Then I'm going with you." Ethan started to argue, but she cut him off. "You need someone to watch your back, and I'm the best shot here next to Jack. We're wasting time." So they split the crew. Jack pushed the main herd toward Billings while Ethan, Clara, and 2 other cowboys rode after the thieves. They followed the trail hard. The rustlers weren't pros, just opportunists, which could be good or bad. Amateurs make mistakes, but they also panic. After a few hours, they found them camped in a ravine, cooking up stolen beef. "4 of them," Pete whispered, "and they're all armed." "So are we," Ethan growled, ready to charge right in. But Clara stopped him. "Ethan, anger gets men killed. We wait for dark, we plan this out, and we win it smart." Every bone in Ethan's body wanted to fight, but he listened to her. "Fine, we wait for dark." As soon as the sun went down, they moved like ghosts. Pete took out the single sleepy guard without a sound. Then Ethan stepped into the firelight with his rifle leveled. "Hands up, nice and slow." The 3 men scrambled for their guns, but Ethan put a warning shot in the dirt. "The next one finds a home in one of y'all." One of them stammered, "We found these cattle." "Liar," Ethan said. "You stole them. And out here rustling is a hanging off fence." Fear washed over their faces. "Now, you're going to leave your guns, leave the cattle, and walk away. Be thankful I don't string you up myself." They walked. Ethan and his crew pushed the recovered cattle all night, reuniting with the main herd by sunrise. They made it to Billings with only a couple of hours to spare. A buyer named Morrison met them at the pens. "Y'all are early in the season," he said, looking over the herd. "These animals are trail-worn. I can offer $18 a head." Ethan's heart sank. At that price, they'd come up short of the $3,000 they needed for the bank. "They're worth 25, Ethan countered. 18 is my final offer," Morrison said flatly. Then Clara stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, these cattle are tough. They survived storms and river crossings that would have killed weaker animals. That's not a weakness, that's the strongest herd you'll see all year." Morrison seemed impressed. "That's a good pitch, ma'am." "It's the truth," Clara said firmly. $23 a head. 20, he shot back. Clara held his gaze. 22 or we walk." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. 21, final offer. Deal. The final tally came to $3,018. They had paid off the loan. They had saved the ranch. They had done it. When they finally saw the cattle pens in Billings, Ethan felt his knees buckle. Clara caught his arm, her own face wet with tears. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually won." The crew let out a roar of celebration, but Ethan could only look at Clara. She had fought beside him and believed in him when no one else would. "Marry me," he said, right then and there. She blinked, then a smile broke through her tears. "Ethan Cole, that is the worst proposal I have ever heard in my life." "It is the only one I have got," he said with a small grin. "Then yes, you stubborn, wonderful man. I will marry you." And he kissed her, surrounded by tired cowboys and the sounds of the herd they had saved. The next morning they found a small church on the edge of town. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes. "You two look like you have been through a war," he said. "Something like that," Ethan answered. Can you marry us today? The preacher looked worried. Son, marriage is not something to rush into just because you feel lucky to be alive. Clara stepped forward. Reverend, I have known this man for 2 months. In that time, I have seen his character more clearly than most people see their spouses in a lifetime. We are rushing, but we are not being foolish. The old man studied their faces and finally smiled. Well then, let us get you two married, and with their crew as witnesses they were. They stood before the preacher still smelling of cattle and dust, with simple gold rings that cost more than they had to spare. When Ethan kissed his bride, it was like they had all the time in the world. Their new life began with a trip to the telegraph office. With a shaky hand, Ethan wired $3,000 to the bank. The operator handed him a receipt, proof that the fight was finally over. He'd heard about Clara's smart deal-making. Ethan just squeezed her hand, prouder than he'd ever been. Standing in the street, it all felt real. They had won, but their troubles were not over just yet. That afternoon, Jack pulled Ethan aside with a serious look. The crew had done the impossible drive to pay off a debt. Now that debt was paid. The men needed to know if staying on to rebuild Silver Ridge was worth their while. Ethan's heart tightened in his chest. He could not lose these men, not now. That evening, Ethan told the crew the plain truth. He had almost no money left for wages. But he offered something more valuable, a stake in the ranch. Not land, but a share of the profits. They would be partners, building something together. It was a gamble on a better future. A few men chose to leave, and no one held it against them. But 6 good men, including Tommy and Jack, decided to stay. They were family now. Pete joked they were working for a man with $60. Clara corrected him with a smile, saying she had $8 saved up too. The laughter felt good, but the 3-week ride home was hard on Ethan. He worried constantly about what they would find. Clara saw the trouble on his face. She told him that worrying doesn't change a thing. It just makes the road feel longer. They would face whatever was waiting for them, together. Out on the trail, they saw how much things were changing. A settler had built a cabin right across the open range, blocking their path. He claimed the land was private now. Ethan wanted to argue the principle of it, but Clara stopped him. Their fight was for Silver Ridge, not with one stubborn man. They would just have to adapt like always. There was no sense in picking a fight they didn't need to win. That night, Ethan confessed he was scared of the future. He felt the West he knew disappearing. Clara looked at him across the fire. She said they were more than just survivors. They had faced down every terrible thing that should have broken them. Now it was their time to be builders. They would build something beautiful and strong from all the hardship. Ethan knew she was right. They had survived the worst, and now they would build the best. When they topped the rise, what was left of Silver Ridge Ranch lay below. Ethan's heart sank. The barn was just a skeleton of charred wood. But the mess had been cleared, and new boards covered the house's broken windows. Smoke curled from the cookhouse chimney. Jack's hand went to his rifle as they rode in slow. On the porch sat Elizabeth, Clara's friend, sipping coffee. "Took y'all long enough," she said. "Been waiting 3 days." Clara jumped down and hugged her. Elizabeth handed Ethan an envelope. It was from the government, an advance on the reward for capturing Nathaniel Crow. Inside was a bank draft for $2,000. He whispered the amount, realizing it was enough to rebuild, restock, and give their home a real second chance. "Y'all deserve it," Elizabeth said, then gave Clara letters from the women they had saved. They were all safe now, building new lives, because Clara had been brave enough to speak out. That night they had a real feast with good whiskey Elizabeth brought. They toasted to Tommy, the kid who took a bullet but saved a calf, and to Pete, who grumbled but never quit. Ethan quietly raised his glass to Clara, who saved them all. She stood and said, "No, to all of us. We did this together. We fought for each other, because that's what family does. And y'all are my family now." Later on the porch, Clara asked Ethan, "What happens now, with us?" He turned to her. "Now we rebuild, Clara, not just the ranch, but us. I want to build a life here with you, a life that lasts." He took her hands. "I know I'm not an easy man. I'm stubborn and proud. But I will fight for you every single day. I'll choose you over my fear and my pride. You are my partner in everything." Clara smiled. "Good, because I plan on holding you to that." They kissed under the big Montana sky, two broken people ready to build something whole. The next morning, the work began. As they cleared the foundation, a rider brought a telegram from the bank. Ethan's gut clenched, expecting another threat. But it was a receipt. The loan was paid in full. The lien on Silver Ridge was gone. "It's over," he said, the paper trembling in his hand. "Clara, we're free." They sat on the steps, letting the truth sink in. No more debt, no more looking over their shoulder, just the honest work of building a life. In the months that followed, Silver Ridge was reborn. The new barn rose from the ashes, bigger and stronger. The house got proper glass windows. Clara's garden bloomed, and Tommy became a top-notch roper, his scarred shoulder just a memory. Jack passed down his wisdom to the new hands. Then Elizabeth returned with the final news. Crow was convicted on all charges. The rest of the reward was on its way. Justice had been served. "It's really over," Clara said, taking a deep breath of free air. "I can finally just be Clara Cole." Ethan smiled. "I like Clara Cole." That Christmas, Clara told Ethan they were going to have a baby. He was speechless, terrified, and thrilled all at once. Their daughter, Grace, arrived late the next summer, healthy and perfect. The whole crew treated her like a little queen. Holding her, Ethan finally understood. The land was important, but it was the people, his family, that made it all worth fighting for. Years later, Grace would ask for the story of the cattle drive that saved their home. "And you lived happily ever after?" she would ask. "No," Clara would say gently. "We lived fully ever after. The happy and the sad, the brave and the scared." Ethan would add, "But we stayed together. Through everything. That's the most important part." And it was true. They built a life not because it was easy, but because they chose each other, day after day. Silver Ridge Ranch became a legend in Montana. And so did the love story that started with a burned-down barn and a woman with a secret. It was a story that proved the best things in life are built on courage and the grit to fight for what truly matters, even when all the odds are stacked against you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.